the functions of. So as you can see, there's a lot of things to consider when we're choosing a fat from a health point of view. Now, there's two other omega-3 fatty acids that are in our diet. Those are DHA and EPA, docosahexaenoic acid and icosapentaenoic acid. These two are considered healthy choices, and soon there will actually be some dietary recommended intakes for these fats. So what are some of the foods that have DHA and EPA? Most of the time when we think of those, we refer to fatty fish, such as salmon, mackerel, sardines, halibuts, bluefish, tuna, trout. The lean fish, like your haddock, your cod, flounder, only contain very small amounts. Almost the only source of omega-3 fatty acids is seafood, especially the fatty fish. So fatty fish are such an excellent source of DHA and EPA, and because they're so important for health, it's important to get those regularly in our diet. So turn to page 106 in your textbook. It contains a chart that has omega-3 fatty acid contents of fish, so you can be updated as to which ones are best choices and how much are in those fish per serving. So what's the benefit of DHA and EPA? What are the functions? They're very important for proper brain and eye development, especially during pregnancy and infancy. DHA and EPA are really excellent for keeping our heart healthy because they reduce our blood pressure, reduce heart rate, can help reduce blood triglyceride levels, and also reduce blood clots, which can start a heart attack. So it acts as a natural blood thinner. So DHA and EPA is extremely important to get from the diet. For more information about fats and oils, I highly recommend referring to the American Heart Association website, which is www.heart.org. To get enough omega-3, it's important to eat about 8 ounces of fish per week, and that's actually not just fish, but a variety of seafood. If you have 8 ounces per week, that'll provide you with the average of 250 milligrams per day of DHA and EPA. And this guideline is based on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans from 2015. Taking in about 250 milligrams a day of EPA and DHA is associated with preventing deaths from heart disease. So it's highly recommended that people include fatty fish in their diet. So a lot of people have concerns because of mercury toxicity. Well, nearly all fish and shellfish contain very small traces of mercury. Although, when I think about it, your biggest risk is not consuming fish. Andrew, you know what? This never happened before, but the slides quit advancing.
Yep.
Yeah, I had another issue in the middle of the presentation.
We're still recording, right?
Yeah, we're still recording.
Okay.
Right. But it won't advance. It's just kind of hung up.
Oh, that is because the Wi-Fi has stopped on me. That's okay.
Okay. And then in the middle of it, there's one section that I don't have slides on, but I go into detail about cooking with oils, and it was going out on me. that didn't happen when I was recording on the other equipment. So
You were talking about.
I was talking about cooking oils, and the slide just kind of went black.
Okay.
And then I had to advance it to get it back on, just so you know.
Okay. So fishing. Do you want to start? Do you want to start again on cooking oils, or
No,
you got it back?
Yeah.
And then redid that.
Right.
And then eventually you got to slide 28, I believe it was.
Yeah, the one before that is where I was.
Omega 3s.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and then the Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Got that on you. Okay.
Yeah, I just didn't know why it wouldn't advance. Okay.
You're good to go?
Okay, good. Thank you.
You have no problem.
Okay. Thanks. Nearly all fish and shellfish contain some traces of mercury, although your biggest risk is really not consuming fish. The benefits of eating fish far outweigh the risk. Please remember that. The EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and the FDA suggest that some fish and shellfish contain higher levels of mercury that may be harmful to an unborn baby or a young child's developing nervous system. The fish that should be avoided are your towelfish from the Gulf of Mexico, shark, swordfish, and king mackerel. And they also suggest that we limit white albacore tuna to 6 ounces a week. So those are for people who are at risk, like pregnant women, young children, or even those who are immune compromised. When we're talking about tuna, oil-packed tuna has more healthful fats than water-packed. Some of the health-promoting fats from the tuna go into the water that's usually discarded. But oil-packed tuna should be drained to avoid all those excess calories. You might want to save the oil from the oil-packed fish to use as an oil in salad dressing, or just when you want that delicious tuna flavor. So a lot of things to consider when it comes to fat and where to get our fat, but the omega-3 fatty acid issue is really a concern. And again, I like to think of certain things as nutrition by addition, and that's why it's important to include fatty fish in the diet, because from a point of view of getting omega-3 fatty acids, it's very difficult to get it if you're not consuming seafood or those non-seafood choices that are high in omega-3s like walnuts. So what are the recommendations for selecting fish for women and young children? We're suggesting not to eat shark, swordfish, king mackerel, or towelfish, and eat up to 12 ounces a week of a variety of fish. Don't limit it to just certain kind. Keep a variety. And then if you're choosing fish that's caught in local waters, it's important to check with local advisories to check the safety of it. If you have no advice, if you can't find any information, it's important to limit the fish from local waters. We've covered a lot in great detail about fat, the kinds of fat we eat, the type of fatty acids that are contained in fat, and now we're going to talk about cholesterol. Cholesterol is also a member of the lipid family. Your body actually needs cholesterol to function normally. The difference between fat and cholesterol is that fat is found only in animal products. So here's a good question for you. Does peanut butter contain cholesterol? The answer is no, because it's not from an animal. It's from a peanut. Is it saturated? Generally, nuts are polyunsaturated. But if I buy a peanut butter that's very easy to spread, The ingredient list might tell me that they have partially hydrogenated the fat. So your better choice might be to get a natural peanut butter where the fat is not emulsified and mix it in real good. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to, fats and oils and cholesterol. But again, peanut butter doesn't have cholesterol because it's not found in an animal. Peanut butter does not contain cholesterol because it's not from an animal product. Cholesterol is needed to maintain every cell membrane in every cell of your body. It's very important for your body to make bile acids, which helps us digest fat. Hormones are chemical messengers of the body that influence what your organs do. Cholesterol is needed to make things like estrogen and cortisone. Because the body makes its own vitamin D, it's not essential to get it from the diet. Cholesterol is needed to make things like bile acids. Bile acids allow us to digest fat. Hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers of the body that influence what your organs do. So cholesterol is needed to make things like estrogen and cortisone, and also vitamin D. Cholesterol is made by your body, so it's not essential that you get it from your diet. And that's why the American Heart Association puts a limit on cholesterol to 300 milligrams a day, because your body already makes what it needs. Now, where is it found? Only in animal products: egg yolks, meat, poultry, milk, and milk products. So it's important to have somewhat of a limit, but it's not that you have to place extreme restrictions on yourself, because if you're following the dietary guidelines for Americans or using the My Plate visual for meal planning, it gives very specific instructions on how much of these foods to eat. But again, it's not the cholesterol in food that causes a cardiovascular risk, like many people think. It's actually the amount of saturated fat that we're eating in the American diet that poses more risk. So again, does a pot of beans have cholesterol? Absolutely not. But if you prepare it using sausage or salt pork, it will contain cholesterol. Shellfish, like shrimp and crawfish, are considered moderately high in cholesterol. The form of cholesterol in shellfish doesn't really elevate the blood cholesterol level. Plus, if you actually look at the makeup of shellfish, they're lower in fat and saturated fat, which again is the primary concern that may lead to elevated blood cholesterol levels. Shellfish are such an excellent source of protein. They're low in saturated fat, a good source of omega-3, and they're high in minerals such as selenium, copper, zinc, and iodine. But you always have to think about the method of preparation. So if you're making something like a shrimp scampi and using a lot of saturated fat and butter, then you know that particular product is then going to have a lot more cholesterol and a lot more saturated fat. So it's best to prepare these using lower amounts of fat. So in the case of shrimp, like a shrimp cocktail using cold-boiled shrimp, in a cocktail sauce that is higher in vitamin A and beta-carotene, would be a whole lot better than a buttery dish. But if you choose to have the buttery dish every now and then, it certainly fits in if you don't overdo the quantity or frequency. The dietary recommendation, like I suggested, is that we should limit cholesterol intake to about 300 milligrams a day. The body makes some cholesterol daily. Most people don't need to restrict the cholesterol they eat, because the cholesterol that you eat doesn't really affect cholesterol levels. And you've heard me reiterate that a few times, because many people really have a problem understanding and getting that You've noticed that I've mentioned that quite often because that's a major area of confusion for a lot of people. Okay, what about fat in the body? We talked about fat in food. Now, what about fat in the body? About 13 to 30% of your weight is actually considered fat. Fat is a part of all cells in your body. It's important. It's a very, important source of energy. It's 9 calories in a gram of food. Fat under your skin actually provides insulation. It maintains body temperature. If a person doesn't have enough body fat, generally they can't stay warm. They have a problem being cold. Fat under the skin also provides a cushion. It keeps critical organs safe. It only becomes a problem when it's in excess of 25 to 30% of the fat. Another word for fat cell is actually adipose cell or adipose tissue. So what are the functions? You need fat to help transport the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K throughout the body. Certain fat-containing foods provide the body with essential fatty acids. Essential fatty acids are needed for normal growth and development, for a healthy immune system, and also for healthy cells. If you didn't have enough essential fatty acids, your skin would be very scaly and itchy. So a certain amount of fat is really necessary to be healthy. So that's why we should never get totally, concerned and restrictive with fats, but we should know exactly how they fit into, especially a healthy eating plan, because they are so much more calorie dense than protein and carb components in your food. They contribute a lot of calories. All right, how are they digested? Fats are a lot harder for the body to digest and absorb because triglycerides and water just don't mix. Think about it. And unlike carbohydrates, where the digestive process actually starts in your mouth, breaking down food, there's minimal digestion of fats until they reach the small intestine. And that is where your bile acids actually come into play. So your gallbladder releases bile into the intestine, and that's what helps to break up the fat. They emulsify the fat by splitting it into smaller pieces to allow those enzymes to break down triglycerides into fatty acids. So again, everything is broken down into a smaller part so that your body can absorb it into the intestinal wall, and that's where triglycerides are reformed. So when you've eaten a lot of fat over an extended period of time, your body actually, it can be a real problem for elevated cholesterol levels and for too much fat in your body. So that's why it's important to maintain balance of all the different macronutrients. And when we talk about the macronutrient distribution, we refer to fat being 20 to 35% of our calories because it is so much more dense that we don't need as much of it as we do, let's say, carbohydrates. So, just to reiterate, when we're looking at the My Plate visual, we have 1/4 of our plate is protein, 3/4 is carbohydrates, and we also have fat, but we don't have to add a lot of fat because there's enough fat really contained in our food. And also we're using fat in cooking. So that's why the primary amount of fat doesn't need to come from adding it in the form of butter, margarine, mayonnaise, salad dressing. And that's really a concern with the standard American diet because some people would argue that the fat content of our diet is 45% fat. And that's because we generally eat a lot of fried foods, sauces, gravies, condiments that contain a lot of fat. Okay, we've talked about digestion and absorption. Now, I want you to think about another concept called lipoprotein. Lipo meaning fat, protein meaning protein. Lipoproteins contain varying amounts of fats, protein, and cholesterol. Now, if you were to go to the doctor and get your blood work done, they would do a lipid panel. And a lipid panel gives us a picture of what the fat looks like in your blood. So we've talked about fat in our food. We talked about fat in our body. Lipoprotein is a concept that gives us a picture of what the fat looks like inside of our blood. Blood is carried throughout our body, and many times we have lipoproteins and different kinds of fat floating in our blood. When you go to the doctor and have a blood lipid profile done, they might do something called a panel, which would break down the cholesterol and look at the components of fat in your blood. Lipoproteins are responsible for carrying cholesterol around the body. And we have a lipoprotein called LDL, and that stands for low density lipoprotein. We also have HDLs, which are high density lipoproteins. The LDLs carry cholesterol to the body's cells. I call it the bad cholesterol because the higher the level of LDL in your blood, the greater your risk for heart disease. So I like to consider the LDL, L meaning low, it should be lower in your blood. So when we look at your total blood cholesterol, if your LDL is high, it means it puts you at greater risk for heart disease, so you want it to be low. HDL, or high density lipoprotein, is considered the good cholesterol because you want it to go in, and what it does is it picks up the cholesterol from the cells and takes it to the liver for removal. So when I look at my blood panel, the HDL should be as high as possible, H meaning high. So if I looked at both of those lipoproteins, I consider the low density protein similar to a postal carrier who carries your mail into your box. Low density lipoproteins actually carry cholesterol and deposit it into your artery, which makes it more detrimental for heart disease. I consider the high density lipoprotein like a street sweeper. It goes in and cleans up the arteries of all the buildup of cholesterol. So it's a concern to think about that might even help you understand your own personal blood profile when you go see your doctor. So, dietary recommendations for all of these fats. The acceptable macronutrient distribution range for someone over 18 should be 20 to 35% of your calories. I want you to remember that. You may see that on a quiz, but even more, I think it's important to understand, again, the percentage of the different nutrients and how it looks on your plate. This just shows me that fat is important. We understand that because we need those essential fatty acids. But if we have an excessive amount of fat in our diet, it's very easy to be able to have a lot of calories without being able to include enough food to get all your nutrients. So again, the amount of fat that you eat doesn't have as much of a relationship to heart disease as the type of fat. The type of fat is extremely important. By choosing mono or polyunsaturated fats instead of saturated can help lower your risk. It's the same thing with trans fats. If you avoid or try to avoid trans fats, you're doing your body some good. The dietary recommendations also suggest that we consume less than 10% of our calories from saturated fat. And anytime you can replace it with a better monounsaturated fat, the better for you. And to give you an example of this, that's what I mean when I say, why not saute something in a little bit of oil, and then if you want the butter flavor that has more saturates, add it as a finishing product. You want to try to really avoid partially hydrogenated oil and trans fats because those are the most risk. Those put us at the most risk for heart disease. And then anytime you can use a vegetable oil as your primary fat, instead of an animal fat, that would be a very good choice. So what happens if you normally cook something like a pot of beans with sausage or salt pork or ham hocks? It might be better to use a variety of onions, different kinds of onions and bell peppers to generate your fat. Or maybe use less of the sausage than you normally would to lower the content of your saturated fat. When it comes to cholesterol, most people really don't need to restrict their intake because it's not the cholesterol that really provides the harm, it's really the saturated fat. The last recommendation is to eat 8 ounces of fish, preferably the fatty fish, every week to get those wonderful omega-3 fatty acids. So the American Heart Association makes these recommendations for controlling fat and also boosting heart health. Again, if you want more information on that, there's some really great resources on the American Heart Association website, which is www.heart.org. Okay, we talked about this throughout the chapter, but what about fat in your health? Well, when we look at chronic disease and look at the major problems, contributing to, unhealthy Americans, heart disease is the #1 killer for men and women. It's the LDL cholesterol that contributes to clogging the arteries, and not only that, it makes them less flexible. So the diagram on your right looks kind of like a garden hose. On the left, you'll see a normal opening for the arterial blood to flow through. Because of the amount of saturated fat in the diet, we tend to have a buildup of fatty deposits in our artery, which then narrows the channel for the arterial blood to flow. So just like a garden hose, if you have anything clogging the inside, the water's not going to flow as freely. And that's what happens with our diet and with heart disease. The artery wall gets thickened by fatty deposits and plaque buildup. And not only does it clog your artery, but it makes it less flexible, and it puts you at risk for heart attacks and stroke. So what's the difference? Basically, a heart attack is when your blood flow is suddenly blocked from your heart. And a stroke is when the blood supply is cut off to a part of your brain. Another word for a stroke is a brain attack. If deprived of blood for more than a few minutes, parts of the heart and the brain can die, and that's why it's so critical that you get help immediately when a sign or a symptom is occurring. And that is why we want to really improve the health of our clients and the health of our population, because #1 disease is heart disease, and we know that it can be affected and improved by a better diet, and in particular a better type of fat. It's important to heed those recommendations. The primary fat, or the primary way in which LDL cholesterol becomes too high, is by eating too much saturated fat and too many trans fats. Okay, I mentioned that throughout the chapter, but that it's really important to heed that recommendation. But there must be other risk factors, right? Absolutely. If a person doesn't have enough exercise, or if they're carrying way too much body fat and are very overweight, if they have high blood pressure, or if they have diabetes, or if they're smoking, all these put people at risk for heart disease. So all these things contribute. And you can have a very healthy diet, but if you don't clean up these other risk factors, then you're still, carrying the potential for having heart issues. This particular slide and the next few slides actually give us a picture of ways that you can eat healthy. And I mentioned a few as we went along, but using oil instead of the butter, or stick solid fats, choosing lean animal proteins, whether it's fish or poultry without the skin, or choosing some of the very lean cuts of meat, which there are a lot of them. You don't need to eliminate fat or eliminate beef or red meat. A lot of people think it's better to eliminate, when in reality it's better to just look at the quantity you're eating and watch the method of preparation. So again, there's a lot of different ways to continue eating the way people like to, but ways of eating it healthier. Certain foods like pizzas and burgers are just generally going to be higher in saturated fat because of the cheese and the high fat meat. But if you made your own and you decrease the fat by using lower fat cheeses, maybe have vegetables instead of pepperoni and sausage, or even using lean ground beef and getting a lot more flavor from vegetables. So there's a lot of ways to choose healthier fats in the diet, and I want you to take a little bit more time than I did just now to review some of those. The culinary focus in this chapter is really interesting and good because it talks about dairy and eggs. Milk is such an excellent source of high quality protein, and protein is a macronutrient we're going to cover in our next chapter. It's also very rich in carbohydrates and riboflavin, vitamins A and D, calcium, and a lot of other minerals, so it's an excellent source of food in our diet. Fortunately, we can choose between non-fat, low-fat, and also whole milk. And if you choose the low-fat or non-fat, you're also reducing the saturated fat content. Now, when you're cooking with those products, obviously you're not going to have the same smoothness or mouthfeel. But from a nutritional point of view, you're definitely going to be keeping that product a little healthier. What about cheese and yogurt? The fat content can vary quite a lot. There's a chapter in your book there is a chart in your book that gives you the fat content of cheeses. A regular cheese can be very flavorful, and that's the flavor comes from the fat. So I would highly recommend when you're using cheese, don't waste your time on a Kraft powdered Parmesan. Use a Reggiano Parmesan cheese that gives you a lot more flavor. That way you can use less of it, generate the wonderful flavor that you're interested in, and even if it might be a more expensive product, you're not using a lot of it. When it comes to yogurt, there's many differences. What you want to look for is a term that says contains live and active cultures. That way, it's very good for your gut health. Greek yogurt, as opposed to regular yogurt, is strained extensively, and that helps to produce a very thick and creamy product with less sugar and actually more protein. So Greek yogurt is a very, very good substitute for sour cream, and also to extend mayonnaise if you're making a little spread for a sandwich or a salad. I mentioned when it comes to cheese, I use a technique it's called grating or shaving, and that way you can use a little bit of cheese that goes into it's evenly spread throughout the product. So, and also shaving it gives you some added visual appeal. But when you're doing that over a dish, you're actually getting a pop of flavor as opposed to melting it into the product, which you might not think it's there, and then add more cheese, and then you're adding to the saturated fat content of the diet. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're talking about fat in cooking, and we talked about taste being the number one influence on how people are going to choose your food. So you never want to sacrifice flavor, but there's many different tips, like using cheese at the most critical part of the preparation just before service, so that not only the flavor is there, but the aroma. And that is, something to consider when you're really trying to have more balanced cooking. This picture just gives you an idea of what the microplaning dry feta cheese looks like. Less is more, but you want to really not sacrifice flavor. That's really most important. If you're looking at trying to reduce cholesterol and you use a lot of eggs in your cooking or a lot of eggs for eating a lot of eggs for breakfast, you can always use 1 yolk and 2 egg whites. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we cover the protein section of our book. But in the case of lowering the cholesterol content, the yolk is primarily where the cholesterol is contained. There's absolutely no cholesterol in the white of the egg. Yogurt is such a natural alternative to mayonnaise and sour cream and dressings. In fact, I substitute it a lot. And you can't really taste the difference if you really balance it out with other ingredients. But it really gives you such a nice alternative to regular salad dressing, which is generally, over 100 calories a tablespoon. Nice picture of substituting yogurt for marinades. You can also use yogurt as a marinade to, improve the texture of your meat. It acts as a tenderizer, just like acidity in vinegar would. We covered a lot of ground today, but in summary, fats and oils are a part of a healthy diet. But the type and the amount of fat used in food preparation are extremely important considerations in healthful menu planning. Dietary recommendations suggest that fat be limited to less than 35% of total calories. All fats are a very concentrated source of calories, so total fat should be limited to avoid weight gain. Saturated fat, trans fats, and dietary cholesterol should be reduced in favor of healthier oils. Plant oils are generally more heart-healthy options. Now be sure to participate in the discussion board topic on culinary and nutrition trends. And for further information, please refer to your textbook. Thank you.